Great, everyone. I guess we can get started now. Thank you all for joining the Democratized Development webinar, System Changes Towards Equity and Inclusion in the Midwest, Vision and Practical Grant-Making Steps. And so I'm really excited about today's webinar and the presenters, the esteemed presenters really sharing some of the work that they happen in different cities in the Midwest. My name is Lloyd. I am the Senior Program Manager for NFG's Democratizing Development Program. And once again, thank you all for joining us. A few housekeeping things for those that are using your phone and using the webinar. Make sure you use the bottom left hand. There's a little button there it's called Join Audio, and that gives you basically your name will pop up on the right hand side to let us know that you are actually a part of the call. Definitely ensure that you mute your phone. And throughout the presentation, even through the Q&A section and towards the end of the call, there is a comment, a chat button that you can see at the bottom. I guess it's the bottom right there next to the share screen button, where you can actually comment. So click that button and add comments, questions, or any other feedback throughout the presentation. Quick little thing about NFG's Democratizing Development. The Democratized Development continues to create and support what we're calling a political home for philanthropic and community leaders committed to supporting community residents and institutions organizing deeper and advocating for policies that benefit low-income and communities of color to create a people-powered alternative vision for local development. Before I pass it on to our esteemed moderator, Kevin Ryan, I really want to do a quick plug to actually showcase some of the work that we've been doing in democratized development. We are actually planning a Learning in Action tour in Pittsburgh on June 19th through the 21st. You can go online to our website, nfg.org, to learn more about the Pittsburgh tour, but it really showcases and connects what this people power vision look like in local development and the intersections of a lot of things that's happening in this political moment. Once again, I'm really excited about this presentation, being born and raised in Flint, Michigan, attending the University of Michigan. So anything that says anything about the Midwest just makes me personally excited. So when the idea of this webinar was sparked by Kevin Ryan, I thought this was a great thing and really appreciate our presenters for joining us. So let me actually present our moderator. Our moderator for the call is Kevin Ryan. He's the program director at New York Foundation, where he manages a portfolio of active grants for startup organizations that focus on community organizing and advocacy, and oversees the foundation's capacity building program that includes workshops, small grants, and individual capacity building requests. So with that said, once again, thank everybody for joining the call. I'm gonna pass it on to you, Kevin. Kevin?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about
All
that.
right.
Well, these
No
mute
problem.
buttons are tricky. I wanted to thank you all for being here. I'm also similar to Niall. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, so the Midwest is very close to my heart. And a number of issues really brought this session to fruition. First is the Midwest has been in the news quite a bit over the last few months post-election. The election results in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and other states were surprising, and a number of analysts have tried to figure out why did those results happen. For years there have been reported challenges that cities such as Detroit and Chicago, Milwaukee, the cities, folks today are from those cities today. You hear about it, but the challenges have been really marked over and over again in the media, and I think sometimes accurately, sometimes not accurately, which makes me always feel that the Midwest is one of the most misunderstood parts of the country. And then there's been a lot of discussions about how to revitalize cities, towns, rural areas, and Midwest states that have gone through some significant economic, racial, and political challenges over the last few decades. So, and then the final thing that really was one of the things that hit home for me was a recent Foundation Center report, Key Facts on U.S. Foundations from 2014, cited the Midwest as the least funded region in the entire country. So those stark facts, and then also knowing some of the leaders who will be speaking to you today, and some of the work that their organizations are doing, and many of the organizing and advocacy groups that are on the ground in these places, but whose stories are often not heard or told. We just feel like it was a good time to actually present about some of the systems change work that's happening in the Midwest, and in this case, an example of 3 places. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker in a second, but really today what we're trying to highlight is this political moment and the intersections of various issues that are happening in place, and how the foundations who you'll hear from today are trying to address those issues. So I'm going to first turn it over to Grace Howell, the president of the Woods Fund in Chicago, for us to begin our conversation today. Grace?
Thanks, Kevin and Niall. Good morning, everyone, or I think good afternoon to some. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you and my colleagues about the work that is taking place here in Chicago. I'm going to really hit kind of 5 points quickly. If you could advance the slide a couple times to page 2. Just give you a snapshot of who we are, Woods Fund Chicago, context for the region, our key strategies in the way that we approach our work as a foundation, areas of progress, opportunities, and hope, and then really practical grant-making lessons that we have drawn from the work that we do. If you could advance. So just to give you a sense really quickly of who I am, I joined Woods Fund about 5.5 years ago. Prior to that, I worked in state government at the Department of Human Services, and before that, I worked in immigrant and refugee rights as well as social services in the nonprofit sector. So I've taken a tour of all the ways that folks can work in systems change, mission-driven organizations. And so really quickly, who is Woods Fund? Woods Fund Chicago, we're a private grant-making foundation that funds organizations that draw on the power of communities to fight the brutality of poverty and structural racism. And so on this slide, slide 3, I just kind of highlight the different words that I think emphasize and give you a sense of what is important to us and who we are. Funding, obviously, we're a grant-making foundation. Draws, we invest in leverage. I think one of the things that we recognize with a relatively modest endowment is that change around structural racism and poverty cannot be on our shoulders alone as grant-making foundations. Power, we are unabashedly able to talk about power and people. Communities is at the core. Fight, community organizing, policy change, brutality. That is something that we intentionally included in reflecting who we are, because I think that we can't forget how brutal violence, disinvestment, and perpetual underclass impacts communities. And then, of course, being really focused on systems change as it relates to poverty and structural racism and getting the root of the problem. If you could move to slide 4. I think many of you probably have some familiarity with Chicago, but in terms of the high overarching context, I think there's a lot of evidence and data to support racially disparate outcomes in Chicago across a variety of touch points: education, affordable housing, criminal justice, etc. I think that we need to confront and acknowledge the historical and intentional private and public discrimination and structural racism that has produced those outcomes. And there was a recent report by Metropolitan Planning Council that really highlighted the historical and current high levels of segregation in Chicago that are outside of the mean nationally, that produce and impact all of these issues that we're talking about as it relates to equity. It has been hard to kind of see the impact of law enforcement, community trust, legitimacy issues that are producing not only high levels of violence but, you know, chronic structural violence. And, you know, the outlier for Illinois, kind of that covers all of this, is not only the federal impact, the administration and its kind of values, but as the state, we are the only state in the country that has not been able to pass a state budget. We have not had a state budget for 2 years. And so the Governor Rauner, since he's been in office, there has not been a state budget. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but as you can imagine, it is devastating our nonprofit sector, our services sector, and really impacting people of color. And so,
excuse me, Grace, can you hold on for a second? For those that are typing, just make sure that we put our phone on mute. We actually put it in the chat, but I want to make sure that people are muting their phones or computers. Thank you. Continue.
Thanks. So if you can move us on to slide 5. These are just some data points that I think provide further context. Chicago's homicide rate in 2016 is at levels that we haven't seen in the region since 1996 during the crack cocaine epidemic. And unfortunately, African Americans continue to be overrepresented among Chicago's homicide victims, and in fact, overrepresented at every stage of the criminal justice system. Race is consequential in determining whether also a police complaint will be sustained. So if you move to slide 6, this kind of puts a fine point on that. Black-white police misconduct information. So one of the startling pieces for me is, like, regardless of the race of the individual making the complaint against police in Chicago, only 2% of all cases result in any sort of disciplinary action. As it relates to blacks, 76% of use of force incidents are against African Americans. African Americans filed 61% of complaints, but only 25% were sustained. If you look in the other column as it relates to whites, whites were victims of 8% of use of force incidents, filed 21% of complaints, and 58% were sustained, which indicates that 3.5 times complaints were more likely to be sustained for whites than blacks. So that's kind of the context, which seems somewhat bleak. I'm going to move to slide 7, because this discussion is centered around a little bit of economics and equity. And so I wanted to provide some context in those areas. Over the past 50 years, as many cities, we have transitioned from an industrial to service economy. Income and wealth inequality among blacks and Latinos and whites are worse and worsening as compared to the national average. In Chicagoans of color are geographically removed from the city's job centers and have fewer transit options. I'm going to kind of skip through slide 8, but what this really highlights is what I talked about earlier, which is median family incomes for African Americans as compared to whites and Latinx are at proportions that obviously leave certain communities completely marginalized. So these are the facts. And I think that what I want to also talk about is that it's hard to look away from the color aspect of this context if you are a foundation that cares about or wants to have a strong region, is promoted to building healthy communities or safe neighborhoods. You can't be race agnostic, right? And that's kind of what we believe. So moving quickly to slide 7. These are kind of the very high-level key strategies that we engage in at Woods. We have most of our money goes through responsive grant making, only community organizing and public policy advocacy. We do some targeted grant making that we think our dollars and our kind of lifting up the issue will make a difference as it relates to bail bond reform here in Cook County, police reform efforts that really engage community organizers as the key change agents around this issue, restorative justice, really investing in and asking questions as to where there are gaps in strong African American led community organizing in different parts of the city, and then also investing very strongly in low-wage workers through worker centers. We also work very strongly in partnership with philanthropy through, these acronyms, which will probably make no sense to you, but they are Chicago Workforce Funders Alliance, Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, the W.K. Kellogg's Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Initiative, and the Illinois Immigrant Funders Collaborative. And so in all of these foundation collaborations, we try to inject kind of our language and our lens as it relates to racial equity and community organizing and public policy advocacy. And I think one of the key, very important points around our history and our legacy to equity work was that our board in 2008 voted to approve that Woods Fund will have a racial equity lens. And so when we go into conversations, it's not about if, it's about how, right? And that gives us as staff a lot of freedom to talk very boldly about what we hope to learn and do together. So slide 10, hope and progress. There's progress as it relates to community-led police accountability, as I talked about, called the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, a region-wide coalition of worker centers that cross race, region, and occupation called Raise the Floor. I talked already about funder collaborations on a variety of issues from workforce, immigrant rights, and criminal justice reform. And there is really a big sense of partnership and willingness to learn within our colleagues in Chicago. There's a lot of funder learning together, and we're also beginning to act together on issues related to race equity as well. So I'm gonna end with slide 11, which really kind of boils down the lessons that we have taken away as it relates to systems change around equity. Fund community organizing and public policy to address power and long-term systems change. I think be open. We have tried to continue to be open to responsive as well as proactive grant making. And then, finding our unique voice. What is the value add to have Woods Fund at the table aside from financial resources? We try to be an authentic partner and feel equal despite our assets. So we are quite comfortable sitting next to the Chicago Community Trust and MacArthur Foundation because we think we bring value. And we are also willing to be vulnerable. I think this piece is something that I think is critically important, is that we're not afraid to learn and act and then fund, learn more and then act and fund again and repeat. And so trying to avoid analysis paralysis and thinking that there's a silver bullet as it relates to the way to work towards racial equity and really just being on the journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. As people have questions, if you want to add them to the chat, if you go to the bottom of the screen and click on chat, you can add your questions there, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Next, I want to turn it over to Susan Lloyd, the Executive Director of Zilber Family Foundation in Milwaukee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm 90 minutes and 90 miles north of Grace in Chicago. Milwaukee is in southeast Wisconsin. It is 350 miles west of Detroit. So we're sort of between, you can imagine how you would drive from Milwaukee through Chicago all the way to Detroit and tie us all together. Milwaukee is a city of about 600,000. It's a minority majority city. As Grace mentioned earlier, it is like Chicago, an older industrial city, and like Detroit, it's one of those legacy cities that has really been challenged to recover from the manufacturing downturn. And like Chicago and Detroit, it's been hard hit by the more recent economic downturn and by the foreclosure crisis. At the same time, Milwaukee is in a steady but slow recovery. More recently, there's been a real upsurge in downtown development. In the last year, there's been $200 million of downtown development, and we're expecting $2 billion of development downtown over the next few years. So the story I'd like to tell is not so much about the Zilber Family Foundation, but about the history of the community development field leading up to a real opportunity to figure out how that $2 billion worth of investment can actually benefit the surrounding neighborhoods and other communities in the city. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a few observations about the field, talk a little bit about race, class, and place in Milwaukee. And then, as I said, I'd like to talk a little bit about the field of community development in Milwaukee, how we have gradually moved from a siloed perspective to greater collaboration, both within philanthropy, but also across sector. I'd like to talk a little bit about how various efforts we've deployed over the last several years have started to build capacity. There's plenty of room for growth, but we've begun to build some capacity, not only within the field, but the capacity to work across sectors, and then talk a little bit about some of the emerging and strengthening partnerships that really make us hopeful about taking full advantage of this downtown investment in a way that can benefit the larger community. You know, we don't know what the end of the story will be, but let me tell you a little bit about the story. Next slide, please. This map shows the racial segregation in Milwaukee. The green dots are African-American individuals. The sort of orange, yellow, or gold dots are the non-white Hispanics. The blue dots are the white communities of Milwaukee. So as you can see, one of the real challenges is the deep, deep racial segregation by place in Milwaukee. It is, as we seldom like to promote, the most segregated city in the nation. And African Americans live, as you can see, mostly on the city's north side. Next slide, please. You know, the poverty rate in Milwaukee is also significantly higher than many similar communities in the nation. African Americans are almost 40% live in poverty. The citywide average is 29%. The countywide average is about 22%. But if you see, I've provided some of the statistics for the surrounding communities and counties of Milwaukee, where you can see the great disparity between the city proper and the surrounding WOW communities, Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee. The state of Wisconsin has about half the rate of poverty as the county of Milwaukee, and clearly significantly lower poverty rates than the city of Milwaukee proper. Next slide, please. The racial disparities are quite obvious. You know, one of the things that we carried into our work in Milwaukee is this notion of the challenges of concentrated poverty and the fact that in many instances, social problems come bundled in space. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at the poverty rates and the racial segregation, what you find is that many of the challenges are concentrated in the north side neighborhoods where 40% of the population lives. One of the difficulties is that as a consequence, people are often isolated from networks of information, access to resources, and to the knowledge that they might need or want to actually make changes in their neighborhoods. And so one of the real challenges, next slide please, since 2006 is to begin where we were in 2006 with 3 relatively siloed place-based initiatives in Milwaukee. Not the first place-based initiatives in Milwaukee, you know, certainly the Casey Foundation, the Ford Foundation had been in Milwaukee previously over some period of time. But in 2006, you know, when like on the eve of the Great Recession, we have 3 major foundations or efforts around place following slightly different strategies and pretty much working not at cross purposes, mostly in complementary ways, but in not in cooperation or collaboration with each other. The Greater Milwaukee Foundation was investing with the city in healthy neighborhoods. Those were really defined as neighborhoods on the cusp, neighborhoods that could, with one change or another, either be pushed into a healthy trajectory or prevented from falling into greater decline. The Zilber Neighborhood Initiative really focused on the most distressed neighborhoods in Milwaukee, initially working in Lindsay Heights on the north side and Clark Square on the south side. And then LISC had just undertaken in Milwaukee, as they had in other parts of the country, they're building sustainable communities, and we're focused on 5 neighborhoods that overlapped the Healthy Neighborhoods and the Zilber Neighborhood Initiative sites. Next slide, please. What we did was really work hard to understand the larger context and to figure out how those 3 initiatives and others could come together and move from complementary work to collaborative work. And the first thing we did was invest in an assessment of the community development field. Paul Brophy, who many of you may know, Paul Brophy did an assessment for us, and his recommendations were framed in the then new notion of collective impact. He put his recommendations in the larger framework. Maria Hibbs from Chicago came in and did some early strategic planning with banks and foundations and community organizations that had been involved in the Brophy assessment. The foundations got together and funded a citywide market value analysis in partnership with the city, and that helped us to have a sort of common base of knowledge. And we also, as a group, funded Housing Resources Inc. to come in and do the neighborhood housing resident surveys of both property and people's satisfaction in their neighborhoods. And we really focused a lot on trying to promote cross-organizational and cross-neighborhood news and information. And the first thing we did was jointly fund something called the Neighborhood News Service, which is an online source of information. It began with 3 communities and now covers 17 that typically don't get news service or by the mainstream media. We started to have almost annual symposia that would provide the opportunity for funders, banks, community development organizations, residents from communities to come together and learn together. I really appreciated your comment, Grace, about being a learning community, because that's essentially what has emerged here. And then there was also the emergence of the Community Development Alliance. Next slide, please. We invested heavily in building capacity. The photo on the upper left-hand side is a group of individuals who took a bus to the Detroit Policy Link Equity Summit, and on the way there had a facilitated conversation, and on the way back debriefed as a group. And the purpose was really to build relationships. First of all, it was to have everybody have the great experience of being at an equity summit, but also to have people from different walks of life, different kinds of institutions and organizations come together for a facilitated process and bring that knowledge back to Milwaukee. On the photo on the left bottom side is one of the cohorts of the Neighborhood Leadership Institute. Following the visit to Detroit, one of the things the funders jointly did was create a cohort model of leadership development and created a Neighborhood Leadership Institute that pairs someone from an organization with a resident of a community who together have to apply for participation in the Neighborhood Leadership Institute, which is a 9-month, very intensive training program. We've now done 3 cohorts of the Neighborhood Leadership Institute. The Community Develop, next slide, please. The Community Development Alliance actually had its origins in the White House Revitalization Initiative, in that we responded as a group to the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program request for proposals that was distributed to many cities, but not to single entities in those cities, but many people in those cities. I think in part because we had already engaged each other in a conversation. When that RFP was let, we realized that we had the opportunity to apply for funding and that having a common project might move us into a stronger relationship with one another. And that is what happened. Flint, Fresno, Memphis, and Milwaukee were selected as communities for the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program that really focused on two things. One was resident leadership development, and the other was cross-sector partnership development. And so those two things really got a boost and helped to form the foundation for the Community Development Alliance. I mentioned the Neighborhood Leadership Institute already. That also produced a Community Connection Small Grants Program modeled on the small grants programs of many of the organizations who are listening in, who are on this program. The Community Connections Program was and is a resident-led, resident decision-making group that makes small grants to community organizations, not to organizations, but to groups of residents who apply for grants of up to $750 for something that they want to see happen in their neighborhood. Those two things led into what I'll talk about in a minute, which is the Reasons for Hope fund that emerged in Milwaukee. The city emerged as a strong partner in all of this under the rubric of the Strong Neighborhoods Plan. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these things together came to be the Community Development Alliance. The Alliance has about 88 members now. It came into being actually not even knowing what it was going to be, but the leadership expanded as a consequence of people voting with their feet. Banks, financial institutions, intermediary organizations, community organizations, and foundations began to participate in the quarterly meetings of this group. And, you know, it's one of those things where they wouldn't go home. And so we realized, oh, we need to continue this, but we need to structure it in a more effective way. We expanded the leadership of the group to include representation from the business community and from the public sector, engaged in a strategic planning process, and out of that has come several opportunities to fund jointly efforts that will benefit Milwaukee neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Because of all of these activities, when there was the uprising in Sherman Park last summer, there was a vehicle for people to get together very quickly. So within 1 week of that event, Reasons for Hope Fund was created. A nod again to Chicago for having shared information about a similar effort in that city. Reasons for Hope also became a resident decision, a vehicle for resident decisions about what should happen in communities. And residents were the individuals who were recruited to participate in the program and who make the decisions about grants for neighborhoods through the Reasons for Hope Fund. Milwaukee's Choice Neighborhood Initiative is a real example of how the business community, through all of this partnership development, decided to really take hold of Milwaukee's Choice Neighborhood Initiative, that is the largest choice neighborhood initiative in the country. A business located in and near those communities, Johnson Control, a big international firm, decided it would choose to fund in the three communities near its location, its headquarters, which included the West Lawn and Havenswood communities that are the Milwaukee's Choice Neighborhood Initiative. And then all of this together led to last summer the creation of something called Milwaukee United. A nod to Detroit. This is very much an effort that draws on the experience of Detroit and is an effort to ensure that the development downtown over a 10-year term accrues to the benefit of the neighborhoods both surrounding the communities, the downtown area, but also the communities surrounding those 5 downtown neighborhoods. LISC Milwaukee has an effort called Brew City Match, funded by the Kellogg Foundation. It is built on a similar model that's underway in Detroit, and is really looking at how to develop the commercial corridors that emanate from the downtown area, but flow into 5 different neighborhoods in the city of Milwaukee. The data you can use, which is our National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership organization, that entity also funding from local funders and the Kellogg Foundation is working with the Urban Institute on a Turning the Corner effort, which is looking at neighborhoods that are have already turned the corner on gentrification to actually learn from that experience how to prevent displacement in the wake of development in other communities in Milwaukee. And so the Brew City Match, the Turning the Corner are all early efforts to address the opportunity that all this downtown development allows. Next slide, please. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but if you look along the lakeshore there's a building that is in this slide that doesn't appear anywhere else, and that is the new headquarters of Northwestern Mutual. Northwestern Mutual came into this mix very early on with the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program. It rejiggered its grant making throughout the city to focus on the 3 communities that were part of the BNCP program. It also made a decision to build its new headquarters on the lakefront in Milwaukee. So they have invested $450 million in the glass building on the lakefront there. They're also building a $100 million apartment building. In both of those projects, they have far exceeded even the city's expectations with respect to involving businesses from Milwaukee and residents from Milwaukee in those development projects, paving the way for Johnson Control's work, but also paving the way for Milwaukee United with the downtown Greater Milwaukee Committee. The Bucks Arena is going to take up that little space like in the bottom of your slide. That hole is exactly where the Bucks Arena is coming up out of the ground now. They too have taken a real interest in investing in Milwaukee neighborhoods as well as in downtown. So, a few lessons. One, we've really, through, patience, persistence, candid operations with one another, conversations with neighborhood residents, as well as community leaders and civic leaders, we've really begun to change the community development field in Milwaukee. Foundations have really changed their own normative behavior to align their funding to jointly fund projects and to really, as was said earlier, really focus on learning and filling gaps where we can. There are new and different public and private partnerships as a consequence of this effort of the last 10 years. And importantly, there are changes in the way the business community is looking at their commitments not only to downtown development, but to the city as a whole, and really a new focus on equity and equitable development and a new focus on shared prosperity. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really wonderful. Really appreciate that. So I'm going to turn it over quickly for our last but never least speaker, Egnatios, the program officer at Kellogg Foundation. Ed? We can't hear you, Ed, if you're talking.
How's that? I want to say thank you to Grace and Susan. Is that better? Say thank you to Grace and Susan for doing such a great job of sharing with us some of the difficult work. Place-based work is difficult, and particularly, as Grace noted, there's no silver bullet, and there really is the need for authentic and long-term kind of work. And as Susan indicated, the progress is really important to share those stories so that we all stay in the hunt. We all stay in the work. So I do not want to go from the beginning in Detroit, because many of you have heard different things in Detroit as place-based work. But I really want to take a snapshot of what lessons have emerged in the last 10 years and where we at Kellogg are going as we look forward to the future, and how you really take a mature community and approach place-based work with a little different lens. And so you could go to the first slide. And I don't have I don't have as nice a slides as my colleagues, so please bear with me. First of all, I want to just say by background, the population of Detroit is hovering around 650,000. It is a vast majority African American, about 85%, and about 10% Latino. However, the only other figure that I think tells a story is that the percentage of children 0 to 18 in Detroit that are Latino is 30%. So the percentage of children is 30%, even though the population is only 10% as a whole. And so Detroit is a community of color as a gigantic city, as a fairly good-sized city. And so some lessons that have emerged in 10 years, I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work for the Skillman Foundation for 7 years, and the opportunity and privilege now to be with the Kellogg Foundation, but to continue the work in Detroit. And so I want to just run through some quick lessons that have emerged. Number one, building capacity for social change in communities of color is the goal of effective place-based philanthropy. In other words, we need to be able to exit and know that community of color is better for our work. Second lesson is not all philanthropic investment is effective. Duh, but I'm going to say that out loud. And third, the real new rule number one is to do no harm. Much like physicians, we need to practice with that rule in mind. And too many times, we in the foundation philanthropic world do harm even though we don't intend to. And maybe we do harm too much. So the new rule number two is to follow the rule number one religiously. And unfortunately, as many times as people have said, we really need to talk about our failures. I have yet to attend a conference on failures in place-based work or anything else. Now, maybe somebody else has. Please let me know, because I would love to do that. The lesson that really emerges from Detroit is when you have seen one neighborhood, you have really seen one neighborhood. But, next slide. I really think there is a systemic framework that guides neighborhood capacity building for social change. And one of the great partners that I've had the opportunity to work with is Frank Omawale Satterwhite from the West Coast. And he just has a lot of insight on this. And I'll just give you a piece of it. He has a book called Honor the Work, or Building Capacity for Social Change in Communities of Color. And he says these three principles, working from, within, and for the community, work together to build capacity for social change. And he has really good diagrams, and he really understands that. However, the other piece of this is that it really is a simple city or a complex city. Each one has to have certain functions operating. And clearly, Chicago is a complex urban area. Even Milwaukee is a complex urban area. But we're involved at the Kellogg Foundation in 3 cities in Michigan: Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Battle Creek. And I have to tell you, Battle Creek, with a population of 60,000, is very different, but no less complex than Grand Rapids with 150,000 or Detroit with 650,000. And each has very different dynamics. In Grand Rapids and Battle Creek, it's communities of color that have been excluded from the mainstream economy and the mainstream resources and the mainstream services. For Detroit, we are a majority of color, and we are a majority living in poverty. And it is a very different dynamic. So for us, we're really at Kellogg trying to look at how do we approach the city now citywide. We know there are good neighborhoods that are working effectively. We know that there are good organizations that really do believe in resident leadership. So what else needs to be done? And so we really want to take a look at what are those key functions in a city like Detroit that is struggling on so many different fronts and having some good signs, but continuing to have some intransigent and difficult problems. And so we really take a look at citywide capacity building. So if you could go to the next slide. We've had a number of different, one of the things that this grew out of a number of conversations and many of whom are in the place-based working group, but also Tom Burns, who's done some work in Detroit. There's a whole lot of capacity building that needed to happen in Detroit that was bigger than just a neighborhood. And what we learned as we looked at some of the early failures in place-based is that if residents in a neighborhood and an empowered neighborhood are not connected to a well-functioning city and regional economy, the work doesn't grow and does not build its own energy to continue. So in Detroit, we actually had a city in desperate trouble. And so, believe it or not, government functions was really critical to get restored. And so once we have a government restored in the last 3 or 4 years, we actually have lighting restored to the neighborhoods. I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was very, very important. We really have debt redistributed and changed. I was not a fan of the bankruptcy because I thought the state actually brought it on. And I continue to be concerned about that. But nevertheless, those government functions are now restored. And government can be a partner. We had a void where foundations were actually operating without government able. Not because we wanted that, but because we had that. Business reinvestment and growth as a market, a really critical function. And in the philanthropy, number of us, including Kellogg, have done a number of priming the pump to see that financing exists for those who want to invest in the city and to try to build that financing in an equitable manner. And so we established with the JP Morgan Chase, the first Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. It is now 3 years old. It has gone through almost $7 million, and entrepreneurs of color now have a significant share of business ownership and reinvesting in Detroit, where they did not.
I'm trying to get, what is the number to this tax class?
The third area that we really felt we needed to do was to build some capacity to understand data and work with data. We now have a sense that it's not just about data, but we really needed to restore the civic infrastructure, not in one neighborhood, but in all of our low and moderate income neighborhoods. The well-off neighborhoods were very much at the table. The low and moderate income neighborhoods need to have staff support, and so we are now looking at a collaborative of funders that would pool funds and really help neighborhood residents to build their capacity to be at the table and replicate the successes of the last couple of years. Next slide. Obviously, advocacy of citizen planning is important. And if a neighborhood is not organized and part of that civic infrastructure, it's really not going to be cared for. And the theory of change behind this is very simple. Government does what it does, and it does fine sometimes. Business does what it does, and it can do a very good job sometimes. But without citizens and neighborhoods fighting for residents, without an active community benefits conversation, And we're very proud at Kellogg to have funded, be the only local player, I think Ford Foundation also did some funding, to fund community benefits advocacy that actually begin to build what looks like an equitable development model. And then many residents felt like that was not happening across the city. Of course, we as a foundation didn't get involved with this, but those residents then pushed the city council, and they now have a community benefits ordinance that grew out of that. Obviously, I agree very much with the Milwaukee and the Chicago model in terms of leadership development, and that, and for us, that leadership development continues to grow at the neighborhood level, but there is now a new leadership development that's been done. The Damon Keith Center for Civil Rights has actually focused a set of cohorts every year for the last 3 years as part of the Detroit Equity Action Lab. And they are accepting applications to be part of a leadership cohort that develop a racial equity lens and promise to go back to their organization and to go back to the community and to build racial equity in their organization. And so this, with each of these cohorts, they have done an amazing thing. They refuse to disband. You know, like sometimes cohorts of leaders disband and sometimes they stay together and have a drink at the bar. These folks continue to work together and now integrate into the next cohort. And they have changed the priorities in the landscape of Detroit as it relates to racial equity and the driving towards racial equity. The other function that we thought was very important, but was actually in place and was simply built upon, was this function of being able to actually believe in cross-sector collaboration and then building a culture and skills in collaboration. That it is not as easy as just saying it needs to be done. And we in philanthropy are a great example. When we started to collaborate, it took us, it continues to take us a while to get going. So next slide. So we really see that the agenda for Detroit, or in other words, what do you do after you've built a lot of seeds, and then how do you build those seeds? It's really about continuing to build partnerships, and I cannot stress this more. It can be partnerships that are focused on a particular system, and we call those learning communities, and that has really been able to have providers and residents and funders and thought partners like universities in the same room thinking about that. And with that, we've developed we have a very extensive food and fitness and the food equitable food system as well developed. And then the second one was our ability to do youth employment. And Grow Detroit's Young Talent is now employing 8,000 young people in the summer from scratch in 2008. And it's a win for the mayor, and it's a win for the community, and the people are working together to continue to grow that to the need, which is about 15 to 25,000. But it's really funder collaboratives that become more intricate. We started with the communications around something called the Detroit Neighborhood Investment Forum, and it was really, and it continues to meet. It has been meeting for almost 10 years now, and it continues to meet on a monthly basis. And Kresge and Skillman started it, and now there are over 50 players who meet every single month for communication purposes. But that really set the stage for NEI as a funder collaborative. It took almost 3 years of failure before they began to find some success, and it's now in its third cycle of funding, and that's been positive. The Graham Bargain is the one that helped with the bankruptcy, and then we have additional funder collaboratives in Head Start and Innovative Childhood and the Detroit Regional Workforce Fund, and I'm pulling together one to rebuild infrastructure for residents. So that's very important. I think I mentioned the Community Transformation for Racial Equity. Kellogg has made a commitment for a generation, meaning we are in Detroit till 2035. Not me, not me personally, but we Kellogg are in Detroit till 2035. And therefore, racial equity for us is a number of different things. It is both an end, an outcome, and it is a method of analysis, and it is a method of applying it to our own work and our own grants, grant making. And it is an extraordinary journey. We are highly committed to early childhood education and then employing moms and dads of those young children, 0 to 8, so that they have a stronger family economic security. But we're very committed to replicating and scaling what works. And that is a different thinking than more startup work. We're just moving out of the startup work and into a collaborative relationship with the city and with other funders to make sure we can scale up. And then finally, we think that that's the way in which, and getting residents, making sure that residents are at the table and supported with professional support so that they continue to be a part of the solution, they co-own the solution, they co-design the solutions, and that we build for the future, and that's the recipe for sustainability. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you to Grace, Ed, and Susan for your presentations. We're in the final minutes of our call today. And before we close out, I wanted to see and pitch a little bit interest from this group for doing a Midwest Funders convening. As you can see, we're talking about 3 cities here and the rich content and work that's happening in those places to create more equity and inclusion. And we know there's other cities in the Midwest and other work that's happening. So we would love to actually start to build and organize a Midwest Funder convening to talk about these issues and more. So if you're interested, please contact Niall Malloy, the NFG staff person who really makes us move forward as a Democratizing Development Program group, and let Niall know your thoughts about that. If you have any questions about what you've heard today, please send those also to Niall, and because I would like to keep this conversation going as we move forward in our monthly Democratizing Development calls. So if there's a way to do that, we'd also like to do that. And also, Chris Cardona, I want to thank Chris Cardona from Ford Foundation, who in the chat box added some helpful information about foundation failures and actually citing a couple of blog posts about the topic and highlighting grant makers for effective organizations fail fest at their conferences. So we have just a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask each of our speakers if you could close out. Just going to ask you just quickly to respond to this one question. You're all in different phases of the work you're trying to do right now. What do you feel like is the key to moving the work forward that you've talked about using the strategies that you've talked about? So Ed, I don't know if we could start with you and just get a quick response from you about one of the key components of moving this work forward into Detroit.
I think the commitment to time is absolutely critical, and Kellogg certainly won over new respect even from me from inside by making a commitment over a generation.
Thanks, Ed. Susan?
I would leave you with one thought. Both the Milwaukee United work and similar work coming out of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, which has a 10-year racial inclusion initiative that it recently undertook. Both of those efforts are led by consortia of the business community, the community foundation, the urban league, the city departments that are relevant to the purpose. And because this is an unusual set of institutions in terms of the way they do business, to me, one of the most important things that will be going forward, as it has been in the past, is a willingness to not be nice, to actually figure out how to raise up the difficulties or the problems so that they can be both identified, but even more importantly, be generate a conversation that can lead to one or more solutions. And I think, historically, and maybe I'm just showing my age, historically, philanthropy has been really nice. And I think it's important not to be so nice.
I'll second that. Amen to that. Thank you. And finally, Grace.
Yeah, so thanks. This has been really kind of enlightening for me. And I would piggyback on both what Ed and Susan had to say during the course of their remarks and closing comments, is that, number one, we're excited to be part of the Truth Racial Healing initiative that Kellogg has been leading across the country. And I think in that regard, it puts this construct around racial hierarchy and the goal of pushing it towards true myth status in everybody's minds is a very lofty goal, but I think we have to be bold if we're going to overcome a lot of these issues that we're talking about. And I think related to what Susan just said is, with the work around truth, racial healing, and equity work, and I totally agree that as folks who are working in philanthropy, not only do we can't just be nice, I think we need to be comfortable with being very uncomfortable. I think we have a reputation, which is good, about being very civil and generous, but I think we need to feel very uncomfortable with the current state of affairs.
Great way to close it. Thank you all again. 2 final notes. This session has been recorded, and the recording will be distributed after the call, and you'll be able to listen back to it again and hear some of the key points again. And also, don't forget the Pittsburgh convening, the Neighborhood Funders Group and Democratizing Development Pittsburgh convening is coming up June 19th through the 21st. If you haven't registered, please go to the NFG website to register for that. And I want to thank Niall and Shannon for really helping us put this together and make sure the logistics were correct. So thank you all, and we'll be talking to you soon about following up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Great conversation.